Hey, good morning. So, I'm going to try to do this for the first time for our class, and so please forgive me if the first one is kind of shaky. But I'm going to present you the materials on a video for chapter 3 today. So, let's start off with the big idea. The big idea in chapter 3 is that the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers is the site of the first civilization. That's the site of the first civilization in the world. So, the main ideas of this section include that the rivers of Southwest Asia would support the growth of civilizations, which would lead to new farming techniques that would help cities grow even further. So you have to realize that the rivers supply the resources to allow for agriculture to flourish, which would naturally make the cities bigger because now you have more food. With more food, you can have more people. With more people, naturally, cities are going to grow. So the main idea, once again, is the fact that rivers help the growth of civilizations. Farming would help the growth of cities. Excuse me. Oops, excuse me. So now, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are the most important features of Mesopotamia. Now, Mesopotamia is known as the first civilization, as I mentioned before, and farming would grow in Mesopotamia, which would help develop this civilization. Excuse me. Now, what does Mesopotamia mean? Mesopotamia means between two rivers in Greek, which makes sense because the Tigris and Euphrates are two rivers. And between these two rivers, you would have the Fertile Crescent. And the Fertile Crescent is a large area of farmland. And the Fertile Crescent, if you think about the word fertile and think about the word crescent for a moment, fertile means that you have the ability to give life. And then crescent is, as you mentioned before in class, guys, crescent is like a moon shape. And so the Fertile Crescent is an area of land that's kind of shaped like a moon that is able to support life. Now, Mesopotamia was divided into two regions during the ancient times, northern and southern. So each year, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would flood. And those floods would bring not only rocks, but it also would bring over soil and a mixture of other things that would help farming. Um, now, if you are able to farm a lot of food, you can use that food to feed your people. Sometimes you would have a surplus amount of food. And because you would have a surplus amount of food, you can feed even more people. Or in case of a drought or in case of a bad harvest, you can store that extra food in places so that you can use it for later. So to have extra food would allow you to have a greater civilization, but it also allowed you to have more people. Now, villages would later develop in these first civilizations because of the fact that with more food, you would have more people. With more people, you needed more land. And so these small little towns would grow into villages and eventually into cities. Excuse me. Now, we talked about the first main idea in reference to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Now let's talk about the second main idea. Now, new farming techniques would lead to the growth of cities. Now, farmers began to use something called irrigation. And irrigation is a system that pretty much is a system of canals that would allow the water to flow to help you grow crops. Now, once again, as I mentioned, with an increased amount of food, which we call a surplus, you would need fewer people to farm things. Now, you got to imagine something for a second. Now, if there are less people farming, what are these people going to be doing then? What would happen exactly? Ask yourself that question. What would happen if you have less people farming? What could they do? And the answer is that these people now can do other things. Like for example, they could be merchants, they could be blacksmiths, they can have other occupations because of the need of less farmers to grow stuff. These now people who don't have a job anymore can find other areas to work. Excuse me. So the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Now, the level of water would rise and fall depending on the amount of rainfall that you got. Now, irrigation And the canal system, as I mentioned before, allowed for the control of the floods. Now, in America, for example, we have a system of canals in place that will allow for the Mississippi River not to flood as much as it could if it wasn't any canals there. So the farmers realized the importance of controlling the floods so that they wouldn't completely ruin their crops. So, what are the effects of having a food surplus? Um, so, the effects of a food surplus is the fact that, for one thing, irrigation would increase the amount of food that farmers would grow. Um, with a food surplus, there is more food than actually is needed. So, with this more food, you need less farmers. So, less farmers can now take on other jobs and opportunities. Um, because now these new workers are going to take on new jobs, you have something called a division of labor that's created. Now, division of labor is an idea where now you have people doing different types of jobs. See, before everyone was pretty much a farmer, and that's it. There's no division of labor. Now you can have people do other occupations and other jobs. Um, Now, because of these new jobs, larger projects were taken, larger projects in terms of within a civilization. And with these larger projects, you need organization. Now, think about for a moment building a school. Now, if you build a school, you need someone at the top who manages those at the bottom. You'll maybe have managers, you have assistant managers, you have workers. So you realize with these larger projects, you need to have an organization, you need to have structure and rules in order to get things done. And because of this because of the more food and more people, the settlements grew larger and larger. So once again, you had these small little places now grow bigger and bigger and bigger. We're talking about 5, 6, 10,000 people now, and within a one city state. So, excuse me. The rise of Sumer. Uh, the Sumerians were the people who would be the first people to develop Mesopotamia. The Sumerians are given credit for having the first advanced society, and religion played a huge role in creating order with the Sumerian society. Now, excuse me. One of the main ideas for the rise of Sumeria is the fact that Sumerians once again created the first world advanced society. They created a political structure called city states. They had a strong military, and they built walls around their city state in order to protect them from enemies outside of Samaria. So this is an example of a first advanced society. And imagine if you think about most large cities. I know I went to Nanjing last year, and I remember the fact that there's a city wall around Nanjing, and that city wall was to protect the people of Nanjing from those outside of Nanjing. And so you have to realize that it's not, you know, in order to have a stable civilization, you need to have a political unit, you need to have a government, you need to have an army, you need to have a way to protect the people within that city state. So, what's a city state? Now, a city state consists of pretty much the city itself and everything around the city. Um, the strength of the city state is relied primarily on how strong the military is. There are times in which city states fought each other for more land, and over time, of course, these city states would either lose or gain power depending on the strength of their military. So, Sargon. Sargon was an Akkadian ruler who had the first permanent army, and he was able to defeat all the city states of Sumer. Um, so, when his army conquered northern Mesopotamia, he established what we call the first empire. And what is an empire? What is an empire? An empire is land with different territories and people under one single rule. So, similar to kind of like the Chinese dynasties, for example, when you have one ruler who's able to control a lot of land. Sargon was able to rule for 50 years, um, and even after he died, his empire lasted even 100 years later. So you see the strength of the empire, the strength of Sargon, in terms of even after he died, he was able to actually um, his reign and his power still lasted for 100 years after his death, which is amazing when you think about it. So, the second main idea with the rise of Sumer is that religion played a huge role in Sumerian society. Now, the Sumerian people were a polytheistic society, and polytheistic means that they worshiped more than one god. And these gods had, amazing powers and abilities. Now, priests had built these wonderful statues to honor these gods in Sumer. And the priests, once again, are the people who are kind of like the religious leaders. They're the ones who perform the religious ceremonies so that people worship these gods. So, Sumeria being the first advanced society, there's going to be a social hierarchy or like a social order with those at the top and those at the bottom. Kings, of course, would be at the top. It makes sense. Kings would be at the top, and then right below kings would be the priests, because remember we talked about the fact that religion played a huge role in making Sumeria a great civilization. So you have kings at the top, priests go next. Then you have skilled craftsmen and merchants and traders. Below them, you have a large working class of farmers and laborers, and then below them were slaves. And so those are your five. Those are your five people in regards of social order: kings at the top, priest, skilled craftsmen, large workers and farmers, and then the last is slaves. Mm. So, how were men and women in Sumeria? Now, like with most civilizations, men controlled the political power and made all the laws. Um, sadly, even to this day, sometimes there's still some countries in which men make all the laws and make all the rules. Women tend to stay at home and take care of the kids and cook food. Education, once again, because education seemed to be more important for men. Men are the ones were education was reserved for. Now, there were some upper class women who had education, but the majority of women did not get an education. Now, there were some women who were priestesses in the Sumerian temples. Um, However, once again, you have to realize that, in ancient times, women were viewed as less important than men. So, Sumerian achievements. The big idea for Sumerian achievements is the fact that the Sumerians made many advances that helped their society develop. Um, they would create the first writing system. There were many inventions that would change the Sumerian lives, and art developed during in the during in Sumer. So there were many achievements that we can consider talking about with the Sumerians. So I'm going to stop there right now, and we can talk about this more later.